Okay, so yeah, my name is Kent Vlieger. I'm the state soil health specialist with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. I live and work out of Huron, so kind of right smack dab in the middle of the eastern half of the state. So to get rolling here, we're gonna, hopefully everyone's had a chance to read this, but yeah, this is 8-year-old me, and this is something I wrote when I was that age, so it's something my mom had given me several years ago during Christmas, kind of all the stuff she had saved. So, and there'll be a reason I'm showing this stuff, so before you think this is a guy's genealogy or history lesson, there'll be a reason behind this. So this is 8-year-old me. This is on my grandfather's farm in southwestern Minnesota. Okay, that is my payback for me. If you notice on the previous picture, I was maybe a little bit of a shyster with my tongue sticking out. And those are in the days where once you took the photo, it was permanent. You couldn't swipe it and make it go away or adjust the live view, right? Okay, so this is my son, and yeah, this is just him obviously holding up a large eggplant that we grew. Okay, continuing down my family trail. These are my great-great-great-grandparents. They never came to the United States. They were from the Netherlands. So if you guessed by my last name and her struggle pronouncing it, it is very much a Dutch last name. I am Dutch on both sides of the family. Born in southwestern Minnesota. Extended family lives in northwestern Iowa in the Orange City area. So it's very much, that's kind of Dutch Mecca for the Midwest, right? Okay, so these are my great-great-great-grandparents. Never came over to the United States. This, my great-great-great-grandfather, started off as a day laborer in the Netherlands. So basically just, he was hired by the day to do farm work. And then eventually from what I learned through family history, he kind of became a foreman of a farm for a landowner. Okay, so why am I telling you this? This is where we start to get into the soils part of the talk. This is a soil profile from the Netherlands. It's called a Plagen soil or an Enk soil. And so it's, what's that?
What soil?
Plagen or Plagen. It's more Plagen if you're closer to Germany or in Germany, and it's more the Enk if you are in the Netherlands. So they call this, that soil, and it's called this for a reason. It's very specific, and this soil is actually highly sought after for production still to this day. So a little quiz for you, and you should probably be able to guess this pretty easily based off of the route I'm taking here. What is the largest country in dollar value-wise for agricultural exports? Okay, the USA is we're first for dollars. What's the number 2 country for dollar value of their agricultural exports? Good guess. It's the Netherlands. Okay, is the Netherlands a large country? No, it's not, but they're number 2 in the dollar of their ag exports. So the Dutch know how to grow things. Okay, this is very productive soil, the Plagen or the Enk. This was formed over hundreds of years, basically by a certain type of production method. And so the Dutch were one of the first to develop kind of stall agriculture, so mostly for their dairy animals. And basically the way they had a lot of these farms and areas set up is you had a central area. Think of the farm, for simplicity's sake, think of it as a large wheel with spokes. And the center of that farm, which would be the hub, was where a lot of the animal agriculture was. Especially in the winter months, they would have them housed in stalls. And so they were just like you or I. If you have animals housed or in a lot or in a barn area in the wintertime, they have to have bedding, and you're feeding them. And when they have all that bedding and then you're feeding them in the same area, right, they're urinating on that, their manure drops on that. Okay, and then we can easily clean it out with machinery. Okay, what they did is they took all of that and they basically would spread that over their farm fields in the spring. And so for over hundreds of years, with crop rotation and the spreading of manure waste and the bedding material, this is what happened. This yellow layer right here was the original top of the soil. So it's very sandy below, very productive above with high organic matter levels. So the reason I tell you this is that our management can greatly affect our soils. And over time, and I know this was over centuries, but our management practices And some of the things that we're learning with how to manage our soil can have just as much impact, and maybe even more. It's just what we're going to talk about here quickly. Okay, so I gave this talk to a Master Gardeners group here a couple of years ago in Sioux Falls. So if you're there for that, sorry, you're going to get a lot of repetition today. But I showed this, and I asked how many in the crowd have one of these, and just about everyone's hand raised up. And then I did this, and there was kind of a few chuckles just like that, and then there were a few people that I could see were visibly offended. So the production method that I use in my garden is all no-till. Never been worked, never been tilled, any of that. Reason behind it is people like the smell of worked soil. Anyone here agree? You kind of like the smell of that soil in the spring after it's been worked? I do. I like that smell too. Okay, do you know there's a name for that smell? It's actually identified. It's called geosmin, or like it sounds like jasmine. It's geosmin. And the human, our nostrils are able to pick up a very, very, very minute amounts of it. Okay, so what I'm trying to say is if you're just working your soil because you really like that smell and you like to be behind the machine, you can actually purchase cologne that smells just like that. So purchase the cologne, stop working your soil. Okay, so I'll get off my soapbox there. Here's another reason not to disturb your soil, and this is a little more serious example. So this is a study that I stumbled across. I get sent lots of studies, and I stumble across lots of them too. So this was one on a specific type of basically antioxidant, and it's called ergothioneine. Okay, you don't need to remember that name, but it is an important antioxidant that is good for human health and important for human health. The only way that we can get this, though, is through the consumption of food. Okay, plants cannot produce this, though. So if the only way we can obtain it is through eating plants, but the plants don't produce it, what possibly could produce it that the plant is able to uptake it? Any guesses? Say it again? Microbes, yes, you're very close, and basically it's right along those lines. It's fungus. So there's a soil fungus that produces this ergothioneine. It then interacts with the plant. Through the plant root, it goes up into the plant, and then we consume the plant and we get this. So you can also get it from like grass-fed animals, for example. You can get this. But what they're trying to do in this study is they're showing that the ergothioneine content goes down with the more disturbance there is. And so that kind of makes sense, right? Because below ground life doesn't necessarily like to be disturbed any more than you or I like for our house to get knocked down once a year. They don't like to be disturbed, so the more we disturb the soil, the lower and lower their numbers are going to go, especially with when we're looking at the fungal route. All right. I'd be remiss and not be doing my job if I didn't tell you that if you're having problems with your soils or in your growing area, or if you're thinking about starting a new garden or new production area, look at your soils first. This can maybe cure a lot of headaches before they even get started. You can go on a web soil survey, identify your area, and it'll show you a map of your field, and there's someone in this room that should probably recognize that photo because it's of their place. He's chuckling back there. So yes, this is web soil survey. It'll give you the soil map, and these names might not mean anything to you. All of our soils throughout the state are named. Some of them are have a numeric designation, but a lot of them are named just like this, and those names are going to mean nothing to you unless you're really into soil science. But what you can do is you can advance down certain tabs, and it will tell you, is this soil good for grape production, for example? What is the productivity index? Does it have any limitations? Is it shallow to a clay pan? Does it have a high water table? Is it droughty? Is it sandy? Is it clay? Does it have a lot of silt in there, for example? It'll give you all this information that you can go in there and find. And if you do find that information, you still don't know what it means, go into your local field office and they can help you understand what you're looking at. Okay, so these are the 5 principles that I work a lot with. So my job primarily consists of working with our traditional row crop and ranchers and livestock producers throughout the state. And so these are those 5 principles that I am preaching to them on a continual basis. They apply also for specialty crop production and smaller scale agriculture and vegetable production, not just corn, soybeans, and wheat. So the first two are protecting your soil. This is what our agency has been working with for decades, basically since the 30s when our agency was formed. Keep the soil covered and minimize soil disturbance. And we're going to go through you're going to see all these principles and how I apply them coming up here soon. The next is how we feed our soil. And so that feeding part is the kind of that soil health, that's kind of the newer term that I've talked about a lot, especially the past 10 years or so. So you want to have a lot of plant diversity. You want to have a continual live root in the soil. And you want to have livestock integration, which sometimes can get tricky, especially if you live in city limits. Okay, so this is my gardening area. It's roughly, the area that my family and I maintain is roughly 75 feet by 100 feet. So a larger garden, but not as large as some of you I know. And then it also is associated with a community gardens that we helped start in association with my church. So if you're familiar with the Huron area, we have a large immigrant population, especially political refugees from Southeast Asia, so Burma, Thailand. They're called the Cain people. And so they're a large part of our community. And we basically recognized a need for them to have garden areas. So we originally started this garden to basically give away produce because there's a lot of low-income housing around our church area. And after a few years, and kind of that language barrier was starting to break down so we could understand each other. A lady that my guess is probably was in her upper 70s at the time asked if we could make land available for them to have their own plots. And so kind of a light bulb moment. Well, duh, we've got all this ground that we're just mowing. And so then, yeah, we opened up all these plots. We currently have 68 20 by 20 plots available for anyone that's wants it basically for free. There is no cost. Water's provided, even some tools, that kind of thing. And we're going to expand by another 15 plots because of demand. So we're meeting kind of a need for the community. It also allows people that live mostly in apartments or in rental homes that aren't able to grow their own produce to now have an area that's within walking distance to grow their own food and in some case fiber and also flowers. So this is what my garden area looks like. So this is the 100 feet by the 75. It is surrounded by flowering and fruiting shrubs. And so that serves multiple purposes. A, we get to harvest a fruit off of there. B, it provides wind protection during those really hot, dry, windy days that can take place. And it also provides wind protection just enough that we can minimize our damage during those high wind events that come with thunderstorms. And it also provides a lot of flower habitat and habitat for those predator insects that we covet in our gardens. So it's surrounded by vegetation. We do have a small area for apple trees as well. Okay, then it's basically divided into 4 areas: sweet corn and beans in one area, an area that's designated to a full season cover crop, which is really kind of the linchpin for everything I do, and you'll see that in pictures coming up soon. We've got another area that's got the tomatoes, the peppers, the eggplants, the greens, a few other things. And then we've also got an area that's designated for melons, squash, pumpkins, flowers, and also some small grains that we're going to do here soon, coming up this spring. So this is what the garden looks like kind of right after snow melt in the spring. And so when I was talking to that Master Gardeners group, which was 400 plus people a couple of years ago, and I brought this slide up, there were audible gasps in the audience. Okay, how many of you want your garden to look like that in the spring? Not you. Yeah, most people don't. But I love it, and I'm going to show you why. So this is a lot of above ground biomass, because that's the previous year's cover crop that just grew from early in the spring all the way through freeze up. Yep, that's the cover crop right there. Yep. Previous year's cover crop. Yes?
Do you ever have problems with insect pressure overwintering in that residue?
I really don't, and the key to my insect control is the pollinator habitat around the outside that's never disturbed. And I have lots of predators that are throughout there. We've got a pretty good wasp population, and those are mostly predators. And I've also got a pretty high, much to my wife's chagrin, garden snake population. So, and I'll talk a little bit about those. If I forget to talk about them, I'll tell you why we have so many gardener snakes. Okay, this is what that cover crop area looks like after I have gone over it in 3 passes with our church's large deck mower. And so what I do the first time, you saw how heavy that was, I basically lifted. The second pass I'll make will basically be at that same height with the deck up high with the blades on. And then the next time I'll lower it half again so it's about this high off the ground, and I'll chop again. And that's what we're left. We're left with a heavy blanket of residue that's often 6 to 8 inches deep. And then that is the area that I always follow with my melons and squash. Any of my vining type plants will go in there. And so that's my weed control, and it's my ground cover all in one. Yeah.
What cover crop is it?
So it's a 16, and I'm going to forget something if I try and name all of them, but the bulk of the biomass that you see there is pearl millet. Yep, there's a lot of clovers in there, there's some brassicas, there's buckwheat, you'll see some pictures, there's sunflower, flax, lots of things. It kind of goes through stages. You'll see those cool season things pop up quick, and then as it gets hot, then the cowpeas and the pearl millet really kind of take over. Okay, this is the tomatoes and the eggplants and the peppers, etc. So this is an area that I use a biodegradable plastic. It's of okay quality. It's not as biodegradable as I would like it to be, but it does work. So what I do is I lay down a drip line, cover it with the fabric, and then we plant into there. Basically these pots with holes in them are just to provide just a little bit of wind protection when those plants are seedlings. That's really the only purpose that they serve. And then on the in-between, I plant a living cover of annual ryegrass and a couple clovers, and you'll see some green photos of this coming up soon. So as you can tell, the ground is always covered by something. The soil is almost never exposed, and if it is, it's for a very short duration of time. Okay, this is my sweet corn area. This is not my idea. I stole this from another producer. Basically, it's covered by, this is tree fabric that is, you may be familiar with working with conservation districts. It's quite durable. What you're looking at here, I've been using these same rolls for 13 years. And so this is something I'm probably phasing out of a little bit. I won't have as much need to have this area covered. Basically, it was my weed control getting started. And I just got used to using it, and the corn seems to do well in there. But I'm probably going to be phasing that out and moving more towards a living cover. Composting. Do a little bit of my own, but I cannot produce enough of my own to cover everything that I need. So I do purchase some compost from the city of Huron, which makes a really high quality compost. A lot of cities are starting to do that because it saves them money, and they have a way to reduce waste in their landfills. But this is what I do on my own, is a Johnson Sioux form. So it's basically a form that doesn't go anaerobic, so it's not thermal, it's not hot. And you can see these tubes in here that you eventually take out once kind of the material around there has formed its own tube. And basically what you want to do is you want to create a lot of air exposure for that so it doesn't go thermal and get really hot. It's a slower form of composting, and it's more fungal based than bacteria, but it produces a really high compost value. Okay, so you might not be able to see really well from here. This is what the surface of that garden area looks like, and I've got some of the Johnson Sioux compost form there. It's a little denser, tends to be a little more moist when you're spreading it out, so it doesn't maybe spread really nice and evenly like a drier compost, a thermal compost would. But it's a really high quality and really high value when you test it. Okay, this is that thermal or hot composting. This is what most of the commercial composters, what it's going to look like. They have a row, and then they've got the turner. And this is, the city of Huron actually has a larger turner than this. It's its own self-propelled unit. And they do these really long rows, and then they measure temperatures and turn it when need be. There's actually a few producers that are starting to use more compost to make their own too, some of our corn, soybean, livestock people. So both these composts are, I think, really high value and are certainly worthwhile for either the home gardener or maybe even the market gardener or gardener that's selling their produce. Really something they should consider using. Basically, it's the only form of fertilizer that I add to my soil, to my garden. So this is what that area looks like. So you may be curious how I plant the cover crop mix. Basically, I pour it into a little hand broadcaster. I walk back and forth over the area, and then it gets a light layer of this compost spread over everything. And so this is what it looks like a little closer up. You can see it's really fine, high quality compost, and I spread it about as thin as I can spread it and still cover all of the seeds. So it's probably an eighth of an inch, maybe a quarter inch at the deepest. So it's a really fine layer. If you are using compost, especially if you're not making it yourself, but even if you are making it yourself, I would recommend getting it tested because you never know what might be in there. So the city of Huron, when you purchase the compost from them, they'll give you the test from the file that you pulled from. And so compost can be highly variable in its quality and what's in there. Its nutrient value, and also what this first page is showing what chemically might be in there that would inhibit plant growth or negatively affect it. So you can see this was from 2022 from the city of Huron, and they're giving you 2,4-D, dicamba, for example, NCPA, some things that would be not great for your garden. And then they give you the amount. So they'll give you the limit of quantification is what they call it. So basically, they say if it's above that value, you might want to be careful with how you use it. So you can see it was not detected in everything except for the 2,4-D, and it was just barely over the allowable limit there. I have never had any issues with using their compost, for example. In a lot of years, it'll come back with not detected for everything. So that's just something to be aware of if you're purchasing it commercially or if you're purchasing it from your municipality. Ask for a test, and hopefully they will have that to provide to you. Okay, it also tests for everything that you would want to know, especially for the nutrient value. And so this is one page of that, and it's giving you your nitrogen and phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, magnesium, sodium. Shows you all of those things, even got some micronutrients, zinc, iron, manganese, copper, boron in their levels. Gives you carbon to nitrogen ratio, it's 12:1, which is that's a good ratio for your compost. Gives you moisture, which may or may not care about. Those values, and so you can kind of determine if you're really kind of fine-tuned in what you need for nutrient requirements for your crop, you can broadcast that amount onto a known area. So whether that's by the acre or by the hundreds of square feet. All right, we're going to go through a sequence on basically what the garden area looks like throughout a growing season. And so this would be kind of that early June time frame after everything's been in the ground for a little bit and the cover crop roughly a month. You can see there's the cover crop area. Here's the tomatoes and eggplants and peppers. And there's that living cover I plant, and I just broadcast that. That's that annual ryegrass and clovers. And I'll often get the question, well, why do you want more plants growing in between your rows? Aren't they stealing moisture and aren't they taking away nutrients? I tend to think the other way. They're keeping the ground covered so the ground is cool. Yes, they are using moisture, but I do have drip irrigation under there if I think we are getting a little low precipitation-wise. And keep in mind, I have really sandy soils. So this is mapped as a Carthage with some Forestburg inclusions. So Forestburg grows really good watermelons because they have sand with a perched water table. My soil is really sandy. Not quite as bad as a sandbox, but that's about what it's like. So it tends to be really droughty, and I rarely have to water. Yeah. Yes, I do. I do mow. If we're getting regular rainfall and that cover crop on the in-between is getting high, I'll just go through there with a mower and just mow it down. Just mow it till it's about 4 or 6 inches tall. But it still keeps that ground cover and it's still a living cover. And it works really well for weed control too, because I do it right away in the spring so it gets ahead of any of those annuals that are out there. And if any weeds do come and they're getting to where they're putting on seed or starting to flower, I can just mow them down. So nothing ever goes to seed if there is a weed that makes it into that cover crop area in between the rows. Okay, and we're just going to kind of go through a sequence as the cover crop matures. You can see it gets to be quite the jungle. So this would have been right before I would have mowed. You can see it's getting to that stage where it's not quite up to my shins, but that's where I would, about as high as I would ever let it get. This is the previous year's cover crop area with those squash and melons. in there. One of the ways I avoid some insect pressure on my squash, I tend to have, or at least in the Huron area, it seems like we have a bad squash stem borer problem. And so that's a moth that flies. They lay their egg on the stem, and when that egg hatches, it burrows into the stem. And then basically it's one of those things where you go out in the evening and everything looks fine. You come back the next day and half your squash vines are all wilted and look really bad. That's almost always the squash stem borer. What you can do to avoid those is plant your squash a little bit later. They have flight times, and it's usually in that late June to early July area. So a lot of people, everything's looking nice and growing well, and then everything just dies. If you can avoid that flight time, which is what I do, I plant by seed all my squash in middle of June. And so a lot of people are thinking, man, that's really late. Aren't you losing some production on the back end? Yes, I am. I'm losing production on the back end, but I was finding when I would plant late May or even early June, I would have almost 100% loss most years because of that stem borer. So that's one way I avoid insect pressure on them. Yeah. Just move it to the side a little bit, seed in. Yep, and there's just a little bit area where that cover crop is. Yep. Yeah.
It seems burned up on the outside. What do you use for that?
No, so there's a little bit you can see kind of right here in the foreground, like right there.
Yeah.
Vinegar. Yep, it doesn't kill it, especially on the first pass, but on the second or third pass it often will. But you have to do it when it's small. If the plant gets much past this, it'll just kind of get mad at you for a day or so.
So for the clover you use, isn't that invasive?
The clover I use is an annual, and it doesn't produce seed. Because if it starts to flower, it's usually getting to the height where I mow it. And if it does start to go flowering later in the fall when I'm not worried about mowing it, it doesn't have time to produce hard seed. It's an annual. Yeah. Yes? Yes, yep, it's just basically anything you can buy at the grocery store, so. Yep. Okay, this is a picture of the corn. So what I do is I have pretty good spacing. I didn't show necessarily a real close-up of the rows, but I have wider spacing both within row and between rows. And so while it might not be the way to necessarily maximize production, it is a way that I've found to encourage these plants to express themselves in ways that aren't always seen, especially in our row crop production. And so when you give the corn plant a little more room to grow, it will oftentimes produce basically a main stem and two kind of sister stems. And so this is something I stole, basically the Three Sisters method was something that they would see this quite regularly. What happens is the main stem will produce, you can see I've got three red arrows, stem 1, 2, and 3. And then the purple or pink arrows are showing to the ears of corn. So I have 3 stalks with 1 plant and 6 ears of corn. The main stem will give you the nice large ears that everyone likes to buy and eat. The 2 side ones will produce smaller ears, but they're still what I would say marketable or giveawayable in our circumstance. So this isn't a reliable rainfall year or an average precipitation year or heavy. You'll get this kind of production. If you have a drier year and you're skimping or not wanting to water, the spacing between the plants allows each plant to produce 1 single stem and still have good production off of low water use. Okay, this is even later into the growing season. You can see my cover crop now is taller than I am. I am not a tall man, but that is still a very good looking cover crop. And we've got all the flowers out there for our pollinators and habitat for our predators. A little more close up, and you can see I've got tomatoes growing right next to it. You can see there's no really issue with production. They don't negatively affect each other. In fact, they seem to do quite well. Just a close-up. Sorry the quality's not real great here with the screen, but you can see a lot of the species here. You can see the sunflowers, obviously. You see the pearl millet that's starting to come through here, and will really start to pick up growth here in the hot, dry part of the year. You can see some white flowering here, that's buckwheat. Purple flowering here with some phacelia and vetch. And so I've got legumes in there to fix nitrogen. I've got grass types in there to really produce a lot of above ground biomass. Okay, these are some creative areas that the Cain people produce on. So this is a 20 by 20 foot plot. They really maximize production. They grow quite a bit different produce than you or I do. A lot of leafy greens, a lot of pole beans, a lot of peppers, really kind of the burn your face off type peppers. They're really, really hot. I like spicy stuff, but I cannot eat their peppers straight. So what they do is they have these frames that they grow the vining plants like squash, for example. The squash, which, by the way, they do not let grow for the squash production. They harvest the flowers, and then they stuff the flowers and fry them. So that was something new that I learned. So they have this, basically this canopy that's grown over there, and then a lot of their leafy greens, they grow a lot of different brassica species to put in their dishes. And then, but those brassicas, if you're familiar, you know, like cabbage, something along those, basically a lot of those types of plants, they don't necessarily like it really hot. And so what this does is this canopy provides shade during the hottest time of the day and allows them to keep producing, as you can see on the understory. Now obviously you're hunched over harvesting, but it produces really quite the harvest for them. Okay, so why all this effort to keeping the ground covered and to always having plants growing just about everywhere in my garden? Very little gap where there's nothing growing. Here's the reason. You want to push as much carbon into the soil as possible because that's kind of the currency of the soil. That's what builds our soil organic matter. That's what makes all of our soils in the upper Midwest and Northern Plains so productive is we have this large carbon pool that's in the soil. Okay, so how does that carbon get there? It gets there through photosynthesis in plants. It doesn't get there by magic. It doesn't get there by you or I putting it there. It gets there through plants. So sun, photosynthesis mixes carbon dioxide and water, creates a carbohydrate or a sugar, and then the plant is able to maintain sugar, so it's growing its leaf and its stem, and then its flower, and then its grain. I've got this area highlighted, the exudates. So the exudates are basically a sugar that is leached out of the roots. I'm going to get to that here in a second. Okay, that exudate then feeds microbes, and the microbes feed the soil fauna. Basically, it keeps that soil turnover and the nutrient processing for your plants really on kind of a high octane mix. Okay, and here's what happens. 15 to 40%, depending on the plant and the plant type, of the energy or the carbon that is fixed through photosynthesis exudes through the roots in the form of the exudates. So think about that. If you have a plant, take a corn plant, and it's producing energy through photosynthesis, it's only using 60% of that energy to grow the plant itself and to produce grain and to grow roots. 40% is leaking out of those roots in the form of sugars called exudates. Why would a plant do that? Doesn't that seem really wasteful? It's producing all this energy and 40% of it is just flushing out the bottom. What could be the reason for that? Right? Right, to feed the microbes. Okay, so, but why does it want to feed those microbes? What's in it for the plant? What do those microbes do for the plant? They're bringing in nutrients, right? They can get nutrients or turn over nutrients that aren't available to the plant and then make them available for that plant. So mycorrhizal fungi are a great example of that. They associate with the plant. They basically insert themselves into the plant root, and then they can exchange nutrients. Phosphorus is a great example. That mycorrhizal fungi can access phosphorus that's not available to the plant root and exchange that phosphorus with the plant, and then the plant gives that mycorrhizal fungi the energy because it doesn't have a way to produce its own energy. So that's the give and take that happens. But that only happens with a living plant. That's the only way we can do this, is you have to have living plants. That's the reason I have this in the background. This is a native prairie soil. This is a great display. You can Google it online if you want to see it. But you notice all of our native prairie plants, was there more biomass above ground or below ground? Below ground by far. It's not even really close. And a lot of our row crops can't match that. Most of the above ground biomass, most of the biomass is above ground. Corn is really good at producing above ground biomass, and it also produces pretty well below. Soybeans, not as much. Wheat is kind of close to a 50-50. But that native prairie, this is exactly why we have really soils throughout the state in the upper Midwest, northern plains. So these are just some of the types of the sugars that are exuded out of the roots. That doesn't necessarily, you don't even need to know that. Basically, it's just the form of energy they're pushing out. And then estimated that 64 to 86% of the carbon that is exuded out of the roots returns back to the soil and to the atmosphere as CO2. So a lot of that's getting put back out into the atmosphere in a natural cycle. 2 to 5% of that carbon stays in the soil as soil organic matter. So that's why it can take quite a while to raise our soil organic matter in our soils. But there's ways that we can do this in a little more rapid manner. And this is the kind of the proof to the pudding of everything I've been talking about, and I'm going to wrap up here shortly. This is a soil test from our garden area the very first year that we produced out there. Sandy soil, basically had just been mowed for decades. Very low productivity. I highlighted a few things. At the soil organic matter, the first year I was out there in the top 6 inches, 1.7%. To this past year, we're now at 6% soil organic matter, and a sandy soil is really quite high. And that's why I'm able to produce, that's why I have very little disease issues. I almost never have disease in any of my plants. And that's because the soil is so healthy, they're able to get everything they need from that soil, and they're able to fight off diseases. Also, all that soil biology and soil, I believe I have very little insect pressure. That's soil organic matter. Phosphorus, really quite low, 3 parts per million the first year. Now we're up to just short of 19 parts per million. So where does that phosphorus come from? There's 2 sources. One's pretty obvious, I'm adding it every year. Okay, the cover crop and the compost, right. Okay, so the compost is adding certainly a percentage of the phosphorus, although it's relatively low. What's happening is that cover crop through biology is releasing the phosphorus that's inherent in our soils. A lot of our soils have centuries really worth of phosphorus that's available for our plants, but it's not plant available. It's in the organic form, it has to be released. Okay, that only happens through basically the life or that soil biology releasing it and making it available. Okay, potassium. Not super low, but a little bit low the first year, and now we're on the very high level. It's to the level where I'm a little bit concerned. I really don't want it to go much higher than that. Okay, so why is my potassium level going so high? It's the compost. So the compost source is a lot of wood chips, and so there's a lot of potassium within those wood chips. And so I have to be cognizant of the fact that my potassium is getting to the point where if I start to go much higher, I'm going to have some antagonistic behavior between the potassium and maybe some other nutrients. I haven't seen any deficiencies as of yet, but it's something I need to be aware of, and that's why I spread that compost as thin as I possibly can just to cover that cover crop seed. And the last one we got here is the pH. So the first year, my circles off a little bit, the pH was at 7.9. It's on the higher side, not super concerning, but a little higher than I'd like to see it. And now we're sitting right in that sweet spot of 6.8. So 6.8 is right where you're getting kind of that perfect nutrient release. You're not high enough where it's tying up, and you're not too low where it's either tying up or where it's also tying up values. So that's kind of the proof that's in the pudding there. That's why I do all this. I've gotten to the stage where soil is really humming along. I have very little production issues as far as nutrients not being available for my plants. I rarely have to irrigate on a really sandy soil. So the last 2 years have been drier than normal in the Huron area, especially later on in the summer. My cover crop area never gets any water. It just has to fend for itself and take whatever God provides with rain. And my sweet corn area rarely gets any irrigation. The only time I'll maybe irrigate my sweet corn is during tasseling. The only area of my garden that consistently gets irrigation is through the area that's got the tomatoes and the eggplants, especially my tomatoes when they're flowering and starting to produce.
What type of fertilizer nutrient do you put in there? Bar soil or?
Zero.
Zero?
All my fertility is coming from my compost and my cover crop.
Okay.
Yep.
And would you ever come as far as checking your fruits, like for brick or you?
So I do not, and I get that question regularly. So much of that I think I'm gonna have to go get a bricks meter. I think I should because I know every gardener thinks this, but I have amazing tomatoes.
It would back
well-
up your theory.
Yeah,
If you could prove that.
my tomatoes, so you see all those community gardens, just about all of our produce we're giving away. And so we quite regularly have families that are working their garden plots in the evening. They'll have kids that will show up and they basically want permission to go in and get tomatoes, and then they just eat them like an apple. So they are delicious, even for kids that don't like veggies. So yes, I should get a bricks meter because then I would be able to answer that question better.
Yes, in order for it to go through the video, we've been having the speakers give you the question.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, yep, yep. Yes?
What was your before and after calcium?
Let's see, I don't know if I have my before calcium on here, but I've got calcium levels at medium. I've got 2502 parts per million right now. So my calcium levels would be probably, I would guess, lower on the front end. I'll have to go back and look at my test. I just don't have it on here, I don't think. No, I could get back to you. If you talk to me afterwards, I'll get your contact information. I'll tell you what it was. It was sandier soil, so I would anticipate it's probably a little on the lower side. And my guess is it's probably a little bit higher because of my compost that I'm adding. Yeah, everything gets rotated. I probably didn't talk about that as well as I should have. So basically it goes cover crop followed by squash, vining type plants and melons. And then it will then rotate to the sweet corn, beans. And then after the sweet corn, it will rotate to the tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, etc. And then even with those tomatoes, eggplants, etc., they are not planted in the same location for basically 8 years. Because even though that it's basically rotated every 4 years where I put those plants, the tomatoes and the eggplants, it gets shifted over even within that area, which you can see I can easily do. So I avoid some plant disease issues that way too. Yes?
What's your best case scenario for someone who has to, I plant everything direct seed with seeder or a transplant using a paper pot transplanter, so
Yep.
the top couple inches of soil need to be more blemish free than that. What's the best case scenario for someone that is doing no-till that needs to have a smooth seed bed to plant?
Yeah, so you basically, it's a planting issue. You need a smoother seed bed with not a lot of residue like I would have there. I would first ask if you have the option for maybe some type of row cleaner on either on your planting unit or your drill. Just enough to push residue back if you had higher residue. The other option would be to, if you have that clean bed that you're planting into, if you have a way to add residue or cover after you plant. So it'd be almost something similar to what I do with my tomatoes and peppers. You could plant and then you could broadcast that cover or provide that cover immediately afterwards or during planting even. That's something I would look at. That's something I work with a little bit, not quite on a smaller scale like you may be talking about, but on a larger scale with producers, getting covers in with their row crops.
So I till the top 2 inches of my soil, but I've wanted to switch to a power harrow. Do you have an opinion about the value of one or the other? A power harrow as opposed to tilling, with mixing the soil instead of turning the soil.
Yep, so either way is a form of tillage. I'm always going to say the less the better, but I would look at one so first I would ask why you're tilling it. Is it seed bed preparation?
Yeah.
Okay, seed bed preparation. So I would go with the one where if you're looking at seed bed preparation but you want to maintain cover, I would look at whatever option where you can just basically touch as little of that soil as possible. So maybe one where you could just skim and break up residue if that's your goal. That's
Pretty little, but yeah, I try to keep it.
Yeah, keep it little. So the less tillage the better. And I'll often get that question even from producers. Well, I'm just working the top. I'm just chopping that residue. Well, that's better than a plow or a heavy disc or a chisel. Look at online for a rainfall simulator demonstration. that surface of the soil is very crucial for air exchange and especially for water infiltrating when it comes in rain. If we break apart those aggregates on the soil when the raindrop hits, it basically forms a seal. It takes that sand, silt, and clay, spreads it out nice and smooth, and makes it hard for that raindrop to have access. So that's why I encourage as little of disturbance as possible and having cover. Yeah, I would just look into maybe your planting options. See if you're, I don't know what kind of drill you have or your pot planter, but if you have ways to move that residue to the side, either while you're planting or just
It
before.
does that pretty well if I was just planting one row.
Yeah,
But I plant,
multiples.
like when I'm planting arugula, each, I'm going down one way and then moving 3
Yep.
inches over and coming back the other, so.
Yep, so basically if you were just to move residue, you'd move it back on a plant you just planted potentially, or you're just gonna move it back all the way, so. Yeah, I don't know that you necessarily need to change anything. I would just maybe look at that option of putting the cover back on, either in the form of a previous year's residue or with a living cover. That might be your best option. I'm not sure what we're at for time, but I'm sure we're getting long. Okay. Any other questions?
Do you see anything for pests like underground, like a seed maggots? It seems like with our cover crop practice, we get a lot of seed maggots and stuff.
So the question is, do I see any basically below ground of my because of the cover crop and the heavy residue? This is going to segue back to, I forgot to talk about the gardener snakes, didn't I? So I used to have a squash bug or stink bug problem my first couple of years. In fact, it was really quite bad. They were eating a lot of what I had out there. They were eating the squash, they were eating tomatoes, all sorts of things. And then I just didn't notice them for a couple of years. What I found out is that the gardener snakes that like to live in that residue because it's insulated, so it keeps them warmer at night and cooler during the day. And they also overwinter in those areas where I've got those shrub rows. There are basically some holes that are underneath there created by gophers. So I've got a large population of garden snakes, and they take care of a lot of my critters that are within the residue. I don't tend to see anything that's below ground. Like I don't really have any grub issues or nematode issues, and I don't know why. Maybe I'm just lucky. Maybe it's the sandy soil. I know grubs don't always like to be in the sandier soil, just like earthworms don't necessarily like really sandy soil. I may just be lucky, or maybe it's something to do with the system. I don't know. Sure.
On the landscape you showed, you had grapes on one side. How do the grapes perform? And
So I've got grapes, and they're just table grapes. I'm not growing them for juice or for wine or anything. They're just Bluebell is the variety, so just nothing special about the variety. They tend to grow really well. I probably for an area in my garden. It was kind of my first foray with grapes. Hadn't really tried them before. I've got them in basically the lowest corner of my garden, so if water ever does pool after every rainfall, it pools right by the grapes. Grapes don't really like wet feet.
you mulch them?
Yeah, so those get mulched. That's all around there. They basically get everything. I'll crop right up next to them, like with my sweet corn or tomatoes or whatever. And then the cover crop area, when it's in that area, they'll just be right there. There might just be a small area where I keep clear, right next to the grapevine and right next to the trellis. So my grapes are more for fun. I'm not really producing enough to do anything with other than basically just eat right off of the vine, because that's what happens with 90% of them.
What do you do with your aronia berries?
Say that again?
What do you do with your aronia berries?
Aronia berries, so most of those, this will be probably the first year we'll actually get a good harvest off of them. We will probably make syrup. That's what we do. We have elderberries as well that are very prolific, and we make syrup with those. Yep. And I did have plums. Plums are just given away and people just eat them. And we had that hedgerows row. I don't do anything with that, but there is a lady in the community that will take the rose hips in the fall, and I believe she makes a tea out of them. All right, if there's no other questions, I do have a couple of books if anyone's interested that they can come up here and take. One of them is someone that I actually got the opportunity to meet and work with a little bit in North Dakota. It's called the Soil Owner's Manual. It is more along the lines on kind of more traditional agriculture, but it applies to just about anything that you might want to grow or produce. Another one is called Growing a Revolution by David Montgomery. It's a good book you may have heard about. So if anyone's interested, one of those.